Earlier, but my name is Brian. I'm the lead pastor here at Grace City. So just a couple of things on the front end before we dive in. So this Sunday is what we call Team Member Sunday. And so this is basically for anybody that serves on any kind of particular team in any capacity or way. And so that could be on setup team, it could be Grace City Kids, it could be a small group house church leader, it could be in worship, it could be a hospitality door holder. This is kind of anybody that really kind of serves and works in any kind of capacity or way to kind of make things go. And so the only way that church is possible in this kind of environment is by the work of a lot of people. And so if you're on one of those teams, I know people hate this stuff, including myself, but this is why it's great to have the mic and to not be in your position. But if you're here and you serve on any capacity, can you just like stand up for a second? Like you just serve in any capacity. Go ahead. I know you don't want to, but just go ahead and say, can we give them a hand? And if you're sitting, shame on you. All right, you can be seated. There is an area in the back. If you're here, there's an area back with just kind of treats, those types of things. We have free iPads for anyone that serves. So the rest of you guys, I'm just kidding. We don't have that, but there is tate pastries, which is like not like an iPad, but it's delicious. So that room's in the back. If you're here and you're like, man, I would love a tate pastry, that would just light me up. There's a code on your chair. You could scan that today, and if you sign up today, you can. Okay, I'm not gonna do that. All right, so let's dive in. So we're in a series called Alternative Community. And so essentially what we're looking at is, what does it look like? And this has been a bit of a challenging series. Like, what does it look like to be a community, to be a people of God in our cultural moment? So like assessing, okay, this is kind of the cultural narrative that we find ourselves in. We're in 2022 and we're in Boston in particular, in New England, that has its own kind of unique challenges. But we're thinking through like, what does it mean to be an alternative community inside of the community that we are in? One of the things I do want to say just kind of on the front end, just so you understand me well, and so there's not any kind of like misunderstanding, is that in talking about a lot of these things, what I don't want to come across as if there's some like good old days that I'm desiring and longing for, right? Like the good old days actually were only good old days for certain people, right? Predominantly me, a white male. And so that's not what I'm going after. I'm actually looking at, okay, how do we move forward as a people of God, embracing the way of Jesus in the culture that we find ourselves in? And how do we do it in a way that honors God? Because that can be really challenging. And so a couple of weeks ago, we looked at this idea of how do we be a community of loving relationships with one another, like actual loving relationships in a moment where the individual is supreme, in a moment of a cultural kind of moment of individualism that just says, man, you are what's most important. You're what's most valuable. How do we be a people? Because that runs counter to loving community. That runs counter to the way of Jesus. And so how do we do that? Last week, we looked at this idea of how do we be a people, a church, a community that embraces orthodoxy and all that comes along with that while navigating the unique kind of cultural, ideological idolatries of our day, right? There's all kinds of conspiracies out there, right? Like there's all kinds of different kind of ideological thoughts that exist, right? You've seen the YouTube video or you've seen whatever the post is. And so how do we, as followers of Christ, being faithful, how do we navigate that? What are we to do with the fact that some of those ideological idolatries have made their way into the church? Unfortunately, have made their way into what it means to be the community or the church of God. And so this morning, really excited this morning. This morning we're talking about how do we be a community of hospitality in a cultural moment of political hostility? Now, if you're new here this morning, you're like, man, this is what I was hoping for. Like I was hoping we were going to talk about politics and religion. That was really going to fire me up, right? And so that is what we're going to talk about. Hopefully, we'll leave this place. It'll be balanced. It'll be nuanced. And I'm not, we're not registering to vote in the back for a particular political party. All right, so just relax. But I do want to talk about how do we be a people in the way of Jesus, practicing hospitality to one another in a cultural moment of extreme political hostility. And I think all of us would probably agree with that statement, that we live in kind of a unique moment when it comes to kind of political stances. And so what I want to do this morning, I essentially want to address these kind of three questions. We'll work our way through them. Where do we stand in our kind of cultural moment? So we'll look at just the place that we're in. How did we get here? How did we get to this kind of political hostility that exists? And then what are we to do? Like, how are we going to move forward in front of that? So let's deal with first with where do we stand as a culture? So Stanford University in 2015, they put a study together, and this was the title of the study. It was Fear and Loathing Across Party Lines, New Evidence for Group Polarization. Fear and Loathing Across Political Lines, New Evidence for Group Polarization. It's a 2015 study. Here's what they found. They said, our evidence demonstrates that hostile feelings for the opposing party are ingrained or automatic in voters' minds, and that the effective polarization based on party is just as strong as polarization based on race. Now, that last part is the key there, where it says that polarization based on party is just as strong as polarization based on race. They did a similar study in the 1960s, and they asked a question. They simply said, okay, if your child was to come to you and they were to say, we're going to marry this individual, what would most upset you? Like, what would most frustrate you and upset you if they said they were going to marry this individual? There were two things that they said would most upset them. They said that if my son or daughter came to me and they said they were going to marry someone of a different religious faith, so someone that didn't align with me from a religious faith standpoint, that would frustrate me. This was in the 1960s. The second thing, and most of you could probably guess, the second thing they said would most frustrate me is if they married someone of a different race. So religion and race, that was in the 1960s. A few years ago, did another study where they were kind of looking at this kind of idea and kind of trying to track it culturally along with how it goes. And there was actually a new category that was added at the same type of level as both religion and race. Can you guess what it is? That's the same question. And the answer that was right up there at the top with those was if my son or daughter married someone with a different political affiliation. Now, what's fascinating about that study is it says it's on the kind of the same, this hostility is on the same form of that it was for race. Now, if you know anything about our country in the last 75 years plus, right, that the hostility and division that exists along race is pretty high up there. Like it's been a pretty difficult kind of process and journey to walk through. And what this study was kind of correlating and saying is that they're saying now there's a very similar type of level of hostility around political affiliation, around how you identify in your political party, that there's that type of difficulty and hostility. That if there's someone, here's the time that we find ourselves in, right? That if there's someone that has some kind of different kind of political affiliation than you, we treat them a lot of times as if they're what? They're less than human. Like the reality is there are people even in this room, inside the church, we know this to be true because I've talked to various people, maybe not this church, but other churches that exist, that can't fathom that someone else would vote differently than you would vote. But can't fathom it. Doesn't even register or make sense. We've been kind of trained to think in these types of ways towards one another. This is kind of the moment, the kind of cultural moment that we find ourselves in. That we're to be a people, and we'll talk about in a second, but we're to be a people who primarily exist as sons and daughters of God, as brothers and sisters in a community of God, while at the same time we have this kind of political discourse going on around us that would seek to divide us and destroy us. That's our reality. That's the moment that we find ourselves in. The second question that we have to ask ourselves is like, how did we get here? Like, how did we kind of get into this weird kind of awkward space? Andrew Sullivan, he wrote an article for the New York Magazine a few years ago. And this is the title of the article. It says America's New Religions. I'm going to read a couple of just, you can go find this. It's really insightful. We can't go in the whole thing, but really insightful article. But I'm going to read just a couple of places for it and kind of set us up to see how we got here. So this is what he says. He's not an Orthodox Christian. He's just kind of a cultural observer, writer. This is what he says. He says, so what happens with this religious rampart of the entire system is removed. He's like, so what happens? So he's basically going to say, okay, we've kind of removed faith from daily life, right? He's not talking about faith as a political party power. He's just saying in our daily dialogue, we've kind of removed. There's an increase in those who would be what we would call nuns, non-affiliated with faith, those types of things. So he says, what happens when this religious rampart of the entire system is removed? He said, I think what happens is illiberal politics. The need for meaning hasn't gone away, but without Christianity, this yearning looks to politics for satisfaction. He goes on, as religious impulses, once anchored in and tamed by Christianity, find their expression in various political cults. These political manifestations of religion are new and crude, as all new cults have to be. They haven't been experienced and refined and modeled by a millennia of practice and thought. They are evolving in real time. And like almost all new cultish impulses, they demand a total and immediate commitment to save the world. Moves on. He says, now look at our politics. So he says, okay, so let's observe our politics. It's been removed. He says, now look at our politics. We have the cult of Trump on the right, a demigod who among his worshipers can do no wrong. And we have the cult of social justice on the left, a religion whose followers show the same zeal as any born-again evangelical. They're filling the void that Christianity once owned without any of the wisdom and culture and restraint that Christianity once provided. So essentially he says, okay, the way that we got to this moment, this kind of high level of hostility towards those who would affiliate in a different way than us, and let's just talk culture for a moment, not necessarily the church. He said the way that we got there is we removed the kind of, what I would say, we kind of have this faith void. And in this faith void, this kind of cult-like political adoration and affirmation stepped its way in and said, I will fill that void. I'll fill that void. But because there's still a deep level of need in all individuals for meaning. Meaning void doesn't go away. It still exists. We can remove the kind of faith mechanism, but it doesn't remove the necessary need that we feel inside of us. Tim Keller, talking about political idolatry, says this, because this is what it's become an idol to many people. He says, the increasing political polarization and bitterness we see in U.S. politics today is a sign that we've made political activism into a form of religion. So we're seeing this all across the board. He goes on. This may be a reason why so many people now respond to U.S. political trends in such an extreme way. When either party wins an election, a certain percentage of the losing side talks openly about leaving the country, right? We're all seeing it. We're like, I'm out of here. They become agitated and fearful for the future. They have put, so here it is, because I think he nails it. He says they have put the kind of hope in their political leaders and policies that once was reserved for God and the work of the gospel. He says, when their political leaders are out of power, they experience a death. They believe that if their policies and people are not in power, everything will fall apart. Everything will fall apart. Now, what you're not going to hear me say this morning is you shouldn't care about politics, that you shouldn't care about policy. Like that's not what that is not what I'm saying. So don't hear me very clear. I'm not saying you shouldn't be involved in the political arena. I'm not saying you shouldn't be care about policy and advocating for policy and working towards policy change. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying, how do we navigate as those living and following in the way of Jesus, in which we are guarding ourselves against political idolatry? Because it's working and has worked its way inside of the community of God. We can, is this a safe space? Like we can acknowledge that. We can see it in the kind of cultural trends that we have. Now, what's interesting, right? So it's probably starting around the Enlightenment time, right? There was kind of this thought or move by the Enlightenment thinkers that was like, okay, if we can elevate human reason and remove faith from the equation of life, all things will be better, right? Like we're a product of that thought. That if we let's remove this kind of faith thing, this faith mechanism, let's increase human individual value and increase human reason, and we'll have a more just, loving, and accommodating society. How are we doing with that? Like as you kind of observe the cultural moment that you find yourself in, how are we doing with that? Solomon in Ecclesiastes, he says that God placed inside of all people, it says that God put eternity in our hearts. That all of us, regardless of where we're at on kind of the faith spectrum, are all seeking to find meaning and truth and value and identity in something. And politics has said, like, sign me up. Sign me up. I'm here. This is what we see Andrew Sullivan, this is what we see Keller talking about. Now, they would even say, if you read more into the Sullivan article, he would basically say, not only is there a danger in removing the kind of faith Christian mechanism from the cultural moment that we find ourselves in, he said, not only does politics kind of move itself into that void, but he said, you also move, he basically is implying you also remove the compassion that Christianity breeds. You remove the sense of love and care that Jesus demands, that he's called us into. Last week, working kind of along this line of how did we get here. So last week, we don't have time to go into history, like a history lesson here, but we kind of talked about last week that around the 1980s, there was something called the religious right or the moral minority or moral majority. And basically it was led by a guy named Jerry Falwell. There's a book called Jesus and John Wayne. I mentioned it last week. You can go back and read it. You can kind of go through the whole thing. But it was basically this idea that kind of these Christian leaders, these very influential Christian leaders and rich Christian leaders essentially said, hey, we need to re-engage into the political process and we need to ensure and make sure that Christians sit at the top of the political heap. And they made a strategic move to do that, to ensure. They spent, one thing said, they spent basically like $10 million to get, we can't get into all this, but they spent like $10 million to get Reagan elected and basically let everyone know that Jimmy Carter wasn't a Christian anymore. Jimmy Carter. Okay, so it was this fascinating, so if you go back and read it, it was this fascinating move in the West, because that's what we're thinking about, the West, right? It was this fascinating move starting in the 80s where Christianity, primarily not concerned about holding political power in that sense, is now moved and shifted into a way that in a lot of ways we find ourselves now in. Now, a lot of this we could go into Christian history. A lot of this started with when the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian, and he basically said, hey, if you're in Rome, you have to be a Christian. If you're not a Christian, you die. And everyone's like, I'm a Christian, still recovering from that kind of moment. But there became this kind of affiliation of Christianity and political power. Again, not that there's not value in being involved, but it became kind of the end-all be-all for Christian leaders and those who were leading Christian movements and thought leaders. Now, here's what's interesting. The Old Testament, both the Old Testament and the New Testament writers were never writing what they wrote from a position of political power. So if you were to follow the arc of the Christian story from Old Testament to New Testament, what do you find? The majority of the writers were an exiled people living under an oppressive government, Persia, Babylon, Rome, writing to a politically oppressed cultural minority. That's the arc of the Bible. That's the story of the Bible. That this is who we are. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is that have we aligned ourselves in such a way, the church, let's talk about the church, have we aligned ourselves in such a way that we've given an over allegiance to, an over emphasis on something that the Old Testament and the New Testament writers would have never even conceived? They would have never even thought was possible. They weren't after cultural influence or power. Here's where it lands, right? The writers and the leaders of the early church, these men and women, they weren't after cultural power and influence as much as they were after conformity into the image of Christ. It was about conformity into the image of God. Conformity into the image of Christ was how they made their decisions. Okay. So if that's how we got here, if that's the level that we're at, this level of hostility that we all agree with, we don't need really evidence for that. Just cut the news on. The second one is that's kind of how we got here. It was kind of a move that we've been working ourselves towards. What do? How do we move forward? Three things on how we move forward as a people of God, as a people of faith. How do we move forward? Now, let me lay my cards out on the table at the very front end of this, because I want to be very transparent with you when it comes to kind of political thought system, all those types of things. I know you're super eager to hear what I think. So I feel a bit like an exile, like a nomad, like a political nomad. The reason that I say that is because when I look at the early church, when you kind of study the early church and the movement of the early church and what they prioritized, they essentially prioritized four things. This is what they prioritized. They prioritized the unborn. They did. Abortion existed, and we have historical Christian writings speaking against it. They did. Now, with that came orphan care, with that came a lot of other things, but they prioritized it. The second thing that we know that they did is they prioritized a human sexual ethic that honored God, that existed from their standpoint inside of marriage between a man and a woman. They prioritized it. The third thing that they prioritized was care for the marginalized. The early church was literally working their way through the streets of wherever they found themselves. They were taking in those who were homeless. They were taking in those who didn't have care. They were taking in abandoned children. It was distinctly different than everyone else around them. So much so that their political opponents were using it against them. They're like, wow, they're taking care of our people better than we're taking care of our people. And the fourth thing that we know that they were doing is they were prioritizing and fighting against racial injustice, working against systems against racial injustice. Okay. So can we just be super, if those four things are the those are historical fact, there's not a political party that falls in those four categories, is there? And so I just want to be I struggle with kind of recognizing and aligning myself. Here, let me say it another way. And then I'll get off this and we'll get into, you're like, please, dude, move on. All right. Here's basically, as you look at it, the left would say, so let's say we're talking about left and right. We'll start with the right. The right would say, regulate my body, but don't regulate my money. This is oversimplification. Regulate my body, don't regulate my money. The left would say, regulate my money, don't regulate my body. I mean, this is kind of the moment that we find ourselves in. And so I want to say on the front end, these three things that we're going to look at in a moment, I have found to be helpful as I'm seeking to kind of navigate this process. Because again, I'm not saying that it doesn't matter and it's not important and that you shouldn't be involved. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if wherever you affiliate, right? It's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, how do we faithfully navigate as a people saved by God? As a people who are identifying as a people following the way of Jesus. Okay, three things. Everybody, we doing good? Okay, all right. You're like, please move on. All right, first thing I think that we have to continually do, that I find myself continually doing, is practicing what I call identity formation. Practicing identity formation. Who am I? 1 Samuel chapter 8, Old Testament story. So basically what's happening, we'll look at it in a second, but so Samuel has appointed his sons as leaders over the people of Israel. So Samuel's a prophet, he's appointed his sons. And the people actually come to him and go, your sons aren't actually great. We would rather them not rule over us. And then they ask him a question. We'll pick it up. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 4 and 5. It says this, so all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, look, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways, which is actually a legitimate thing. They're like, hey, we don't trust your sons. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us the same way as all the other nations have. We want you, Samuel, to appoint a king over us. Now, before this kind of period, they were what? They were a people primarily identified as those living under the kingship of Yahweh, of God. This is who they were. So when other cultures and nations saw them, they were what? They were citizens of the kingdom of God. He was their king. They looked different than everyone else around them. It was what distinctly kind of, you could identify them in that way. So now they're coming to Samuel and they're saying to Samuel, we want to be like everybody else. We want to be like everybody else. Moving on, look what he says, verse 6, 1 Samuel 8:6. It says, when they said, give us a king to judge us, Samuel considered their demand wrong, so he prayed to the Lord. But the Lord told him, listen to the people and everything they say to you. Because Samuel is rightfully going like, I must be a terrible leader. Like I've really messed this thing up. But the Lord told him, verse 7, listen to the people and everything that they say to you. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as their king. They're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're actually rejecting me. They're saying no to me. Verse 8. They're doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day that I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods and worshiping other idols and worshiping other Elohims. It says this is what they've been doing. They are not rejecting you. They're rejecting their identity as a people of God living under my reign. Do you see that in the text? They're saying we want to be like everyone else. Now, in verse 9 through 17, we don't have time to get into it, but basically God says to them, okay, I tell you what, I'm going to give you your request. But he says to Samuel, let them know that if they take a king, and that becomes primarily, they're living under the reign of this king, let them know what that king will do to them. And if you go through the text, you can see it. He's like, he's going to take your sons, and they will work in his military. They'll plow the fields. They'll reap the harvest. He'll take your daughters. They'll become cookers and perfumers and bakers. He's going to take your fields and your vineyards, your orchards, your servants. He'll take a tenth of your grain, your like he basically just said, okay, if you want to primarily identify as a people no longer under my sole kingship, this is what it'll cost you. And the people were like, oh no, I don't want that. You're our king. That's not what happened, verse 19. This is why it's a perfect metaphor for where we are, where the church is. Verse 19, 1 Samuel 8, 19 and 20. It says, the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we must have a king over us. And then they identify the issue, verse 20. We've already said it. Then we will be like all the other nations. Our king will judge us, go out before us, and fight our battles. They essentially said, God, we no longer trust you. We no longer identify primarily as your people. We want to be like everyone else. Do you see that metaphor? Like that's the situation that the church finds itself in, where we have to determine and go, okay, am I going to primarily identify myself as a son and daughter, as a citizen of the kingdom of God, or find myself and identify myself? We're talking about politics on this Sunday. It could be anything else, right? This is what we tend to do. Or am I going to primarily identify and find my identity in this other thing, this other particular party? Paul, he was an early New Testament leader. He was writing to the church at Colossae, Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 5. He basically says, okay, I want you to put to death all of the old ways in which you lived. So he gives a whole list here. We won't get into it, but he runs through a whole list of things here. And he basically says, all these things belong to your old nature. All these things belong to your prior life before Jesus. This was who you are. And he says, I want you to put these things away. I want you to no longer live in this way. I want you to live. He actually says, I want you to live in the image of your creator. So the things that your God values, you value. The way that your God would determine you to live is how you live. And then he gets down to verse 11. Look what he says here. This is the part I want to land for us. Verse 11. Because he's like, man, how is this going to happen? How are we going to do this? He says, in Christ, there is not Greek and Jew, circumcision and uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ, here it is. He says, but Christ is all and in all. You cannot get a list of people with greater levels of hostility towards one another than the list Paul just gave us. I mean, Jew and Greek, circumcision and uncircumcision, barbarians, that meant just like utter pagans. The Jews would have never even conceived of being in a room together with these types of people. And now they're called by their God, by Jesus, to live in community with one another. And Paul roots it in what? Paul roots it in their identity in Christ. He says, this is who you are. This is identity formation, that we are a people who don't gather and have distinctions around all these things. We're a people who have distinctions in Christ. I mean, think about this for a second. So think about the early followers of Jesus, right? These men and women that went along with Jesus. Think about how ridiculous his task was. Like if you were going to look over his list of people, so he had people who were zealots, who were like nationalist zealots for the Roman Empire. He had cultural traders who had been like tax collectors. He had Pharisees, he had peasants, he had women, he had leopards. He had everybody in between. People that despised one another, that hated one another. And what did Jesus do? Jesus welcomed them into the kingdom of God. This is what we see him doing. In his years of ministry, he welcomes them into the kingdom of God. He transforms their old identities, and he creates what? A new humanity. This is who we are as God's people. This is our identity. Secondly, so the first thing is identity formation. The second thing is, I just must lovingly say this. I think for a lot of us, we need to increase our proximity to other. One of the gifts of the church that I think a local church can be is increasing the proximity to those who are unlike you. Now, we're great at dividing, but I think one of the things is we begin to kind of think about how do we actually have a posture of hospitality towards one another in a day of political hostility. How do we do that? Well, I think the way that we do it is we decrease our proximity to others. The word hospitality in Greek is actually a combination of two things. It's a combination of friend and a combination, or it's a combination of love that means friends, like a non-erotic type of love, and foreigner. Like hospitality literally means love for the other. Love for the other. That we're to be a people with practicing hospitality towards one another. One New Testament scholar, he says the entire ministry of Jesus is appropriately captured in the phrase divine hospitality to the stranger and sinner. It is to the other. Now, how do we do this? Let me just propose a very practical kind of thought. So if we're seeking to mimic the way of Jesus, and we're thinking about this political kind of arena and area that we find ourselves in, and we're thinking about decreasing our proximity, increasing our closeness to one another that different from us, how did Jesus do this? What did he do? The majority of Jesus' ministry, which I appreciate, is he did what? He just ate with people, like all the time. Like if you go through Luke's gospel account, you're like, does Jesus do anything other than eat? He just like he's just like eating consistently with people. Robert Harris, he's a New Testament commentary. He said in Luke's gospel, Jesus is either going to a mill, at a mill, or coming from a mill. Peter in 1 Peter 4:8, he says above all he's giving instructions to the church. He says above all maintain constant love for one another, since love covers a multitude of sins. And then he says, be hospitable to one another without complaining. It says, be hospitable to one another without complaining. Now, that word complaining in the Greek, it actually means to have a secret displeasure not openly avowed for. A secret displeasure. So he says, be hospitable to the one who is unlike you, who has a different perspective than you. It basically means, hey, remove kind of the backdoor conversations. Do you know that it's really hard to speak critical of someone who's sat at your table? Like I have found that with increased proximity comes increased empathy. Some of the most frustrating conversations I've ever had in the last 2 years. Pick the particular kind of thing that you're dealing with. Is I'll be in a conversation with someone and they'll be expounding their views on whatever. I'm like, oh man, that's so cool. That's great. I love that. I will watch that video, that 3-hour video. And I'm just like, have you actually ever talked to someone that is experiencing what you're talking about experiencing? Like, have you? Have you talked to a girl who's pregnant and like feels like she has no choice? Like, have you just talked to her? Have you done it? Have you been in that space? Have you talked to someone that's had a different race than you to experience the things that they've experienced? And over again, it's like, no, I don't need to because I understand them already. Right? I'm like, get out of my house, right? Like, I need proximity from you. With closeness comes an increasing of empathy. I think if we're going to be hospitable towards those, if we're going to breed that type of community, we have to be the type of people that are willing to get close to others. That may be different. Honestly, I hate using that word because we're actually just brothers and sisters, but I'm using it just to simply say someone who doesn't align with what you align with. Doesn't align with you. We have to begin to do this type of work. I do want to say that some of you, just briefly, really quickly, some of you have what I would call have socially isolated yourself, just in the sense that we kind of live in a day of isolation, of virtual isolation. And I meet so many Christians who listen to the same stuff, watch the same videos, follow the same political commentators, follow whatever, and it's just an echo chamber. And so maybe for some of you, you just need to remove yourself from that. All right, I'll move on. You're like, please move on. All right, thirdly, final thing. We're done. We can all breathe. I think we have to continue work on identity formation as a people, that we primarily identify as sons and daughters living in the kingdom of God. I think we have to increase our proximity to others and thinking about this political arena. And then the third thing, and this is baseline Christian thought, we have to continually remind ourselves of the gospel. Continually. Do you know what it tells me? So when I'm talking with someone, and I know this happens because it has, right? Someone's response to the political kind of leadership that exists, right? Like their response. So I've had people like just lose their mind over one individual or the other, right? In whatever particular place. Do you know what their response tells me? When it's an unhealthy response, I get sadness, right? Let's be reasonable here. Their response tells me more about what they think about the gospel than it does anything else. Because I've talked to people and their response is like, dude, life's over. It's over. Again, all of that matters. As a people, following the way of Jesus, our hope does not come in the political party. It doesn't come through policies. It doesn't come through systems. Not saying those aren't important. Don't hear that. I'm just saying it's not our ultimate hope. What is the gospel? That a rebellious people have been invited into the relationship, into proximity with the God of the heavens, who's created all things, and says, I love you, you're secure, you're mine. And the image that I go back to over and over again in the last, I guess it's been like 6 years of political hostility. The image I go back over and over and over again in my mind is just this image, this picture, maybe this is helpful for you, of Jesus firmly seated on the throne. Firmly. Not pacing, not stressed out, firmly seated on the throne. And so I think our hospitality towards one another, especially those who disagree with us, because that's where the work comes from, I think it'll distinctly make us a different people. I'm not saying uniformity. I'm not saying we agree with one another. I'm not saying we don't care about things. I'm just saying the way in which we talk about one another, the space we spend with one another, and the care at which we direct towards one another will distinctly show the cultural kind of the culture around us that we're a people under Jesus' care.